Thank you very much, Jeff. And thanks to TRCP for hosting this campaign forum. So many facets of conservation and of hunting and fishing have been issues in this campaign, so this forum should be quite informative. As you said, Don Trump Jr. is here with us. Thank you very much for coming and talking to us. Don is the eldest son of the candidate, representing the Donald J. Trump presidential campaign. As executive vice president of the Trump organization, Don directs new project acquisition and development worldwide. He's an avid outdoorsman. He's hunted all over the globe, and he takes his 5 children trout fishing on weekends. 5 kids at once?
Yeah, we rotate them in and out. At once would be a lesson in self-restraint.
That's a lot of patience. So how did you get into the field sports?
You know, I was very fortunate. I think something that all people really need to get into the field sports is a mentor. And my grandfather was a blue-collar electrician from communist Czechoslovakia back in the early 80s. And when I was born, he saw the lifestyle that we had in New York City in our family, with sort of a lot of the benefits of that. And he saw what could have been great about that. But he also saw perhaps some of the perils of that lifestyle. And he had pretty good conversations with my father about making sure that we all saw the other side of the coin. And so from a very young age, I think I was 5 or 6 the first time I went over with him just by myself. He would take me there for 6-8 weeks every summer, again, to communist Czechoslovakia. And it was, there's the woods, I'll see you at dark. Taught me woodsmanship, how to shoot an air gun there. He wasn't Communist Party elite or anything, so there was no hunting, per se, but taught me the basics and got me very passionate about the outdoors, so much so that it became sort of a lifestyle for me. And from then on, anyone that would teach me a little bit or be a mentor in some way, shape, or form, I'd drive them crazy until they took me out and read every book there was and just went from there. And it became a big lifestyle for me.
That's excellent. So how did this passion and this lifestyle, how does this translate into the campaign in terms of conservation?
Well, listen, I think, as a guy from New York City, I don't think my father would ever get the credit for a lot of the things that he's done about this and what we would do as a president to these issues. So, whether it be, again, the conservation side as a hunter or an angler, but, and also certainly as the Second Amendment supporter that he is. So, me being also a competitive shooter, I mean, these are people that I know when I go to SHOT Show, every other booth, I know someone there, and it's not, knowing them because they recognize me because of The Apprentice or something. It's knowing them because I spend time in that world. Those are my friends. Those are the people I hunt with. When I get to travel for hunting, when I'm not hunting in my backyard, doing it myself. Right. And so it's important for people to know those things and to be able to mobilize those people to go out and vote. Because I think one thing that I'd like to see more of is hunters, fishermen, getting out there, being more vocal when they do vote. And showing politicians that they will show up, and that they'll show up in the rain, and they'll show up in the snow and the sleet, because that's their comfort zone. I mean, that's where they play, that they'll show up and actually move the needle. And I think if we can show that one way or the other, and that's whether it be on a national forum or on a state forum, that if you can show that those people will move a needle, maybe we'll actually be catered to a lot more than we have traditionally and in the past.
Very good. Sounds great. Thank you. So we have a lot to cover this morning. What I'd like to do is to ask you a question to introduce a topic, and after you answer, we'll take other questions on that topic. I hope we have a lot of people participating. But I will point out we'll have to move briskly because we have a lot of topics to cover. So let's start right away with federal public lands, a big issue these days. Last week saw the unprecedented approval by federal lawmakers of the sale of national forest lands to the states in which they're located. The House Natural Resources Committee approved H.R. 3650, which directs the Department of Agriculture to convey to a state up to 2 million acres of eligible portions of the national forest system. Because most sportsmen rely on public lands to hunt and fish, and because these sportsmen are finding it more and more difficult to find places to hunt and fish, what message does your candidate think this approval sends to them, and what will your candidate do about it?
Well, we've actually been pretty vocal about this for quite some time now, and this is where we've probably broken away from a lot of traditional conservative dogma on the issue, in that we do want federal lands to remain federal. And That's not to say that the state shouldn't have a larger role, perhaps, in managing some of those lands. I think their scientists are there, they're on the ground, they understand those issues. I think certainly better than a lot of bureaucrats in D.C. But for the lands to remain federal is very important to us because you said it best. I mean, it's all about access. If I used to be able to drive 20 minutes to go hunt and now I have to go drive 3 hours to go hunt, that's going to be the effective end of hunting. It's going to be the end of fishing, et cetera. So what we need to do is make sure that those lands stay accessible. The way the states want it is they want the transfer of these lands and they want it unrestricted. They want to be able to do whatever they want with it. They want it, so lands that used to belong to the entire people now belong to the states, and 2 minutes later they can sell it to fund a deficit because they can't run the sort of deficits that the federal government can over longer periods of time. So one day it's public, the next day it belongs to the state, the next day it's sold, sold off for development purpose or whatever it may be, never to be touched by the citizens of this country who that land belongs to. That can't work. Again, it's not to say that the states shouldn't have more say in perhaps how some of those things are done and run, but they have to remain accessible to the public, because if it's not, that's going to be the end of conservation, because hunters are the original conservationists. It's going to be a major problem for all things. And again, this sport, whether again, hunting, fishing, the outdoors, has been good to me. It's been good to my brother. We're both very avid guys in this world, and it's frankly kept us out of a lot of other trouble we would have gotten into, growing up as, let's say, rich kids in a big city. Right. So that stuff's very important to me. I want to make sure that that's around for the next generation and the next generation following that, because people should all have that same ability. And if I can get a kid off of a couch and away from a video game and into the woods, we're doing them a major service for life. We're doing a service to the habitat, to the animals, that those people are going to end up benefiting conservation-wise, and you're doing a major service to those individuals. So you need the access. That's first and foremost.
Very good. Questions, anybody? Yes.
Just specific to what Mike just brought up, those bills that passed the Resource Committee. So if those passed Congress and came across your dad's desk if he was president, you'd advise him to veto those?
Listen, I think generally speaking, again, I'm not a policy wonk, right? This is a little bit different. I'm going to talk higher level than what I'll do. What I'll do is make sure that there's people in there that understand these issues and understand our policy as it pertains to what I just said. Making sure that those things and that access remains. So, if those transfers happen to the states and the states own them, but they have to remain, open to the public and accessible and usable for hunting, fishing, recreational purposes, that may make sense. So I think you'd have to look at them on a case by case based on what the states would want to do, but that would certainly be on the table to say, no, they can't just be taken over, bought, sold, again, to fund a deficit somewhere else because the states are running themselves poorly and using our federal lands to subsidize incompetence elsewhere in the state.
Yes.
Say your dad wins the election, what would your first priority be as Secretary of the Interior?
I don't know. I may go on if he wins the election based on the long-term sprint that we have to November, I think I'm going to take about a year vacation and just go hunting and fishing. Again, I think that aspect of protecting these lands, making sure that access is there, making sure that I think a lot of time and money has been spent really vilifying outdoorsmen and hunters. If you look at the media today, if you look at everything that's been portrayed about them, and I don't think nearly enough credit is given to them, for being the original conservationists. So I'd love to do anything as it pertains to creating programs whereby you can get youth into it. I mean, I think I've seen that on a state-by-state level where, I participated in the Pennsylvania youth turkey hunt. New York State, right across the border, doesn't have something like that. They do it in other ways, shapes, and forms, but creating an accessible way to get young people into the game so that it's not vilified, so people see where those dollars, of conservation spent. I had an interesting conversation with the head of the New York DEC a few weeks ago at a dinner, and he was saying, he's got a staff of 85 people, and he just retired, and of those 85 people, not one of them other than him was actually a hunter. And he's saying his budget is funded, I think it was close to 80%, by the sale of deer licenses, deer hunting. That didn't include, the rest of it was turkey and waterfowl, et cetera, but deer hunters weren't even represented in the group making seasons, creating the legislation for all of these things. And ultimately you lose that, and you lose the trickle-down effect for the habitat and for everything else that benefits. And so while people on that board may be into the birds, or they may be into butterflies. They may not care about deer hunting so much. The revenue generated by the hunters is ultimately feeding all of those programs where everyone benefits. And ultimately, a good habitat for deer is going to be good habitat for everything else downstream. So, making sure that people realize that we stop trying to vilify it and recognize hunting for the conservation methodology that it is.
All right. Yes, one more question, then we have to move on.
Jody Stemler, I'm here with Outdoor Life. You said, back to the federal land transfer, you talked about states having more say. You said if the states get the lands, they should maintain them. Are you suggesting that part of what you are thinking is going to happen is that the states will get more control and management, or are you talking about wanting to maintain them in federal hands?
I'm saying wanting to maintain them in federal lands, but having input from the states as well. I mean, I think you have some states that have probably done a good job, and some states that haven't done as good a job. But I think people on the ground should have some input.
LWCF is such a win for sportsmen and for all Americans. A portion of the royalties paid to the U.S. government for offshore energy drilling rights goes to conserve land and improve outdoor recreation opportunities. It helps support state and local efforts to acquire and protect public lands and recreational facilities. Even though the LWCF has a budget cap of $900 million a year, that cap has only been met twice in its 50-year history. This year it's set at half that maximum, and we have the TRCP to thank for their work in getting it that high, higher than before. But now some in Congress want those funds for other purposes. What does your candidate tell sportsmen who are finding it harder and harder to find places to hunt and fish about the future of the LWCF?
Well, listen, I think it's important. I mean, it really stems back into question number one, which is access is paramount. So I think any funds of those sorts should be going to preserve that access and that habitat, because without it, it's gone, and then there's a trickle-down effect. Without the hunters, without the revenue then generated, without the revenue really created, and the economy is generated. When you look at what hunters and fishermen contribute to just both federal and local economies, the numbers are staggering, and those numbers are not really often credited. I mean, everyone talks about the commercial side of fishing, but they don't talk about the recreational side and all of the benefits to the local communities and everything. So I think those funds have to be maintained, and they have to, if anything, be increased to preserve these lands, because I mean they are a very special and treasured resource of this country, and they should be preserved accordingly.
We know that, but do you think that your candidate would be able to convince other people?
I think so. Listen. I know my father to be a pretty convincing guy. I know he's going to entrust me with a lot of these issues, and I know that I'm personally going to be involved in here. I mean, that's why, I'm here today. And while I may not be the policy guy, I know I can be the very, very loud voice in his ear, on a lot of these issues. And, to me, they're as important as many other issues that people probably view of, in much greater importance. So I think we could definitely do something there to make sure that those are preserved and maintained, and if anything, expanded, because, I'm a believer in what these things have done for me and for my lifetime, and I want to make sure that it's around for generations to come.
Very good. Questions? Sir?
Yeah, funding. Oh, I'm sorry. On the funding side of thing, in 2011, Grand Canyon National Park decided to ban water bottles. But one of the big sponsors of the National Park Association, I think it's called, is Coca-Cola, and they didn't like that idea, and that idea was postponed. And I'm just curious what you or your candidate thinks of corporate sponsorship in national parks.
Listen, I guess it can be a complex issue, because I don't want to go into the national parks. Some of the national parks I go to, I already think they're a little bit too touristized for myself. I like to get out into the backcountry and really be in the wilderness. That's my personal preference. Not everyone necessarily wants to get or be that rugged. So, I don't want to roll into a park and have, El Capitan with a big sign, sponsored by corporate America, flashing on the rock face there. That said, I think there's ways that you can do it in a way that's beneficial. I think those dollars are worth something. I think eliminating bottles from parks probably takes it a little bit too far, and I think there's probably a happy medium there. I think what you don't want is something that's then overly commercialized for the sake of doing it. But I do think in all things you do have to find a happy medium and a fine balance between the potential revenue source and the benefit that that can create to make sure that these things are actually sustainable, to make sure that they can actually be maintained. And in many cases, they haven't been maintained as well as they should be. So, I think that's all important. Now, again, I'm not saying that you should take every single last dollar that you possibly can and sell out every other aspect, but I do think there has to be a respectable medium that you can come up with to make sure that all of these things are done, in the right way.
More questions on LWCF funding in general?
Rob Drieslein from Outdoor News. Related to your point about being a voice in your father's ear, how loud a voice do you want to be? I believe I read somewhere you want to be Secretary of Interior. Is that true? And if not, who do you think should have that role?
Well, that was certainly the big joke, over the holidays. He basically said that's the only thing in government I'd ever want to actually do, so that came up quite a few times at the conservation, at the holiday tables this year. Again, I think, I don't know that I'm qualified to do it. Again, I'm not a scientist. I'm not, that guy. That said, I think I could speak for a lot of people that perhaps aren't being heard as much. So what I'd like to do is, be very involved in that process, making sure that the right people are put into those positions. Again, to my point earlier about, the New York State DEC and what I've seen across the board in a lot of other DEC places where, people who are anti-hunters are getting on the boards and deciding season dates for hunting and, ultimately using that as a way to get rid of it in the long run. That to me is not acceptable. So making sure that people are involved that understand both sides of the issues. They don't have to be, avid, hunters, but they do have to be sportsmen. They do have to be outdoorsmen. They do have to understand the issues because it's very disingenuous to say, hey, we're going to rake in billions of dollars from these people who are out there, and then we're going to sort of, put some sort of Manchurian candidate in there that is anti everything that you guys want and everything that you guys stand for, and spend your billions of dollars annually, in a way that, ultimately will lead to a slow death to hunters and anglers. So, I would be a very, loud voice in his ear on that. It is something I would take a lot of time out of, my other scheduled to be a part of because I think it's important. I think it could set a great precedent, for the future, of this country and those issues.
Thank you. Anybody else? All right, thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Jody?
Yeah, just back on funding as well. LWCF, federal offshore oil and gas leasing. There's been additional proposals for onshore leasing, increasing or creating renewable funding revenues for that, for wildlife funding, the Blue Ribbon Panel on Fish and Wildlife Conservation. Can you talk a little bit about whether you have a vision of expanding those types of opportunities for more natural resource funding on the ground?
Well, listen, I think, again, things like Blue Ribbon, I think they've done a good job sort of creating a happy medium between both sides where you have, industry working with, outdoorsmen. So, again, to get into the details of that's probably beyond the scope of what I can talk about now. But I think, anything like that does make sense and can cater to both sides and where you have people working together, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think too oftentimes things are so polarized that people just sort of pick a side and then, the logical place where everyone actually wants to be or is probably pretty content being in the middle, sort of gets left by the wayside. So, I think we'd be more than happy to look at any of those things to expand it and, again, things that make sense and became a revenue source, both in terms of, energy, which I think is something that's got to be very important for, our country to have energy independence. But if you can do it in a way that then can also benefit fish and wildlife, I think that's incredible.
All right, we'll move on to clean water. Another easy one.
Yeah.
32 states are now suing the federal government to overturn the Clean Water Rule. The Supreme Court recently ruled that assertion of Clean Water Act jurisdiction is subject to judicial review. This means that wetlands and small creeks are vulnerable to development and pollution more than 40 years after the Clean Water Act was passed. What does your candidate say to sportsmen who feel that fighting for cleaner water and the preservation of wetlands is a bigger priority than ever because we're running out of them, but it appears to be a battle that we just can't win?
Well, listen, it's certainly an important issue. That said, I also think that, with many of these issues, they've become, it's become very difficult because they've used a lot of these acts to really try to drive legislation to prevent anything from happening, to, sort of the frivolous litigation that I've seen and all these, companies that claim to be this that basically are, using loopholes within all of these acts that started off with the best of intentions and made a lot of sense at the time, but never really evolved. And you see all these billions of dollars that could be going into conservation that, you know, the Fish and Wildlife Service is ultimately spending fighting off frivolous litigation from all of these groups that have basically done it as a way to say, hey, we're going to collect treble damages, we're going to have a $100 lawyer, you know, making $500 an hour because they're going to pay our court fees and all of these things. And you know, in the end, I think something that was, you know, meant to be very well intentioned and still serves a very good purpose never fully evolved and has been taken advantage of by a lot of other people. I mean, I think we believe very strongly, obviously, in clean water, but making sure that these things are done to allow natural progress. You know, whether it be in energy, whether it be in, you know, development, we do have to move, and we can't use these acts as sort of a back-end way to, you know, block anything from possibly ever happening anywhere. So, you know, it's a very complex issue, and frankly, it's not even a general issue because you have to talk about it on a case-by-case. I mean, each one of these things is totally different and than the other when you talk about them and you break them down, you know, on a case-by-case basis. But what I've seen in all of this is just the people who've won in this are the lawyers. They've used this to milk all these funds that could have gone to preserving things, that could have gone to conservation. Instead, they're used to, you know, fight frivolous litigation, and that's a shame. So, you know, I do believe very strongly in clean water, but I also believe we have to come up with ways to do this effectively and efficiently so that we don't end up in these stalemates where we're just fighting legal battles for the sake of legal battles.
So what would you tell a private landowner who has a trickle on his property and wants to do something with his property that would affect that trickle, but he can't because of the clean water law?
Well, listen, I would say that, you know, I know guys that do this. I have friends that are, you know, wealthy guys, and they want to spend millions of dollars restoring, you know, former trout habitat. I mean, I've seen this in Colorado with people that I have, you know, friends that have ranches, and they actually want to improve the habitat and the water there, and they're told they can't do anything. You know, that doesn't make sense to me. I mean, it doesn't. It's ridiculous. They can't build a road going to their ranch house that's 2 miles away from the water. Meanwhile, they also want to put in, you know, as part of the same effort, they want to spend millions of dollars, you know, creating better habitat for the trout and the wild native species that are, you know, in those waters nearby. And, you know, that doesn't make sense to me. Again, I think if you're talking about industry running roughshod over wetlands, I think that's a totally separate issue. And so I think they do have to be looked at a case-by-case basis. But again, I think there has to be a level of common sense instilled in some of these issues. And by the way, that's not in talking purely environmental issues. I think that's government in general. You know, there's been a lack of common sense in everything that's done. People pick a side, that's what they stick with. They can't come to a reasonable terms. They refuse to negotiate. There's no, it doesn't make any sense. And I think, you know, ultimately the people that are, you know, hurt by it are the people who are actually oftentimes trying to benefit, you know, the environmental side and, you know, and the economies associated with, you know, the states and the localities that are trying to do these things. So again, I mean, it is very case by case. The things do have to be looked at. I mean, and you have to be careful on how things are done. But, you know, when people are trying to do things that are actually beneficial to their, and, you know, other groups that don't like the way that this person did something else somewhere else, they try to use that to then create a 12-year lawsuit that people are fighting for. It's just a level of inefficiency that is inexplicable to me. It doesn't make sense.
Thank you. Questions on clean water? No one? All right. All right, thank you. We'll continue. On to sage grouse. We all know the modern story of the sage grouse, with habitat loss from energy and other development sending numbers plummeting. An unprecedented bipartisan coalition of federal, state, and local government departments and conservation groups formulated intra-agency plans and projects that would keep the bird off the endangered species list. Last September, Interior Secretary Sally Jewell announced that the work done by the coalition succeeded, no ESA listing for the sage grouse. But that effort is now endangered itself. That remarkable effort is endangered because some in Congress are targeting the funding needed to implement those plans. What would a Trump administration do if this targeting of funds for sage grouse habitat gains momentum?
Well, it's a complicated issue because obviously it's great to actually see, you know, something where there's been bipartisan support, or at least, you know, generally speaking, bipartisan support about something, you know, like an issue. And, you know, again, when you talk about the 140 million acres that's, you know, covered this habitat, it's it does get rather complex because you have a lot of other industry that could benefit from these things. There are other creatures, obviously. It's hundreds, 350 species, I believe, that also benefit from the same habitat that need to be preserved. and again, I think that they can come up with a solution that prevented an ESA listing. I think it's great because it shows that people can use common sense to work towards that. Now, as long as the listing, again, and the corollary to that is some people feel that, hey, it's not listed, but effectively because of the constraints, it is listed, and therefore you can't have energy independence, you can't drill on all of these lands. And so I think, again, you have to come up with a happy medium whereby people use best efforts to go after oil and gas, to whatever it may be, whether it be mining, whether it be oil and gas, because again, energy independence for this country has to be paramount, but we also still have to do what we can to preserve these things. So I wouldn't want to just come to this sort of bipartisan agreement and see it disappear by attacking the funding on the back end, so long as it is truly a bipartisan effort. I think I've seen and read about sort of I guess down towards Gunnison in Colorado, where there's a different sage grouse, and the state had been managing and working with various organizations for 20 years to manage this separate sort of population of, I guess it's a slightly different species of sage grouse. And then Fish and Wildlife Service comes in, no, we're just going to list it, and that's it. And then all of this acreage and all the 20 years of time, money, effort from people who've been on the ground, who understand the issue, who've been tackling it and working with it, for a long time. All of those efforts are just put by the wayside and destroyed, affecting those economies in many respects. So, again, I think you have to have a way that everyone has to get along. Everyone has to be able to work together to preserve that habitat, because that benefits everything downstream of it, but also to not take an area that's the size of Texas and say, this is totally off limits, we can't do anything in these areas. That's not good for our national security, that's not good for our energy independence, that's not good for our economy. So again, it's about finding a fine line and a reasonable methodology by which to preserve all sides of things.
To your point about getting other people involved, H.R. 4739, introduced in March, would give state plans for sage grouse habitat protection priority over federal plans. But it would hold the status of sage grouse as not warranted for 10 years, even if those plans are failing and grouse are declining. Plans are inconsistent from state to state, and it would undo years of work done by the feds for this. So,
again, you need to work with both sides. I mean, that's the problem. I mean, to my point earlier, sometimes the states, they're on the ground, they get it, they have to be involved. Other times, their interests are not necessarily aligned, and one state may be doing a good job of something, and the other may not. So, I think there has to be a way to come up with an overarching principle to take care of these lands and to preserve them, while giving states certainly input into those areas, but not overreaching in any one way to prevent either side. Frankly, I mean, again, it is very complex, and given the nature, it's difficult. But I can't also say, hey, we listed, you take an area the size of Texas, you can't ever do anything on there again. That's also not a reasonable approach. When you talk about our national interests and everything else that's at stake. So, what I'd love to see is that people continue to work together, to see what happens in this process, to see what happens even the implementation of what's been done. If we can see more bipartisan sort of working together, and if that could be a framework for other conservation efforts, I think that would be phenomenal.
I know we have some sage grouse experts here, or at least people with opinions on sage grouse. Any questions?
My name is Josh Zaffos. I'm with High Country News. So you keep talking about this idea of the happy medium. I'm someone who follows these issues. Obviously, on the Gunnison sage grouse, which is a distinct species, there's something on the order of 5,000 or fewer birds. Folks have tried to work that happy medium. Will you pull back and speak more generally? Where would a Trump administration come down on standing up for the Endangered Species Act? Is that something that might overall be dismantled as a federal law under the administration?
I don't think that it would be dismantled. I mean, I think I think it's an important law. I think it's something that's been shown to be good in many aspects. I also think there's parts of it that probably and many of the acts have also been then used as a Trojan horse to prevent anything from reasonably happening elsewhere. So again, when I talk about a happy medium, it's because I think ultimately that's something that's grossly oftentimes lacking. When we look at federal cooperation with on the state levels with a lot of these issues, and so I guess that was talking about 1.2 million acres, I guess, down in Gunnison. When you're looking at it and to then say, hey, you can't go on those lands. Farmers can't graze those lands. They can't. It's not. It's a very difficult issue to be able to tell those people in that economy that, hey, you can't do anything with these lands anymore. I mean, it would be disastrous to the area in many respects. So, do I think the Endangered Species Act has done some great things? I do, but I also think that at times it's been used as sort of a Trojan horse to be able to back end other agendas that probably don't have as much to do with the species in question as as the people pushing their agendas would like everyone else to believe.
Yeah.
I'm Phil Taylor with Environment and Energy Publishing. What would the Trump administration feel about Congress involving itself in Endangered Species Act decisions? One being the sage grouse with land use plans, and another near and dear to the state just north of us, the gray wolf, involving itself in terms of inserting policy language to delist a species.
Well, I think that's come up a lot lately, and when you see the gray wolf and what's going on, I think that has become a problem. I mean, it was a great success story. It's returned back, and now whether you look at it just north of us here, or if you look at it in sort of the Great Lakes region where the gray wolf has decimated moose populations, effectively eliminated the moose hunt. I believe it's in Wisconsin. And no one's managing it, and if you do, it's a disaster. You can't even say it because it's been put out there again. It's this sort of Trojan horse to stop so much other hunting, but no one's talking about what they've done to the elk herds. No one's talking about what they're doing to the sheep herds. And so to take one species that's come back, and they've done a great job managing that and bringing it back, but now it's at a level where it should be managed properly, and in our opinion, should be delisted. Because of the damage that it's doing elsewhere, and I think there can be, a methodology by which you have a healthy herd, so to speak, of the gray wolf and packs, but without doing the excessive damage to the elk herd. And when I have friends going into the Bob Marshall Wilderness for 2-week hunts, and they're coming back, after going there every year for 30 years and saying, hey, we didn't see an elk. I'm hearing this time and time again, and I think you get to a point where you say, okay, well, now it's a sustainable pack. I think you have to do a little bit more to also look at the other species that are affected, not just this. So, again, I think there's a time you have to revisit it. And if it takes Congress to do that because no one else is doing it, or people are, influenced by, one extreme side agenda, I think it's time to have that conversation. And oftentimes, again, what you have is you have people petitioning, and it goes to a federal judge in D.C. who's never even heard of the issue, and you have people putting up a nice picture of a nice friendly wolf, and this is what it is, and they don't talk about the real issues, and you have someone opining on a thing and making federal decisions that probably aren't necessarily based in in fact and science. So I think you do have to have more people looking into it and having an honest conversation about what's really going on there.
Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to fishing, saltwater fishing, and specifically the decrease of fish stock availability to saltwater recreational fishermen. Many saltwater fishermen feel that current federal management practices, which are designed to maximize fish populations, leave them shortchanged with very short seasons and limits. For instance, the recreational red snapper season in the Gulf of Mexico is 9 days long this year with a 2-fish bag limit. Studies have shown that the economic and social value of the red snapper is much higher as a recreational fish than as a commercial fish, and yet these practices are reducing that value. And this is happening all while experts say that red snapper stocks appear to be at an all-time high. So what would your candidate say to recreational fishermen who feel that federal management practices are effectively making them stop fishing?
Well, listen, I think people have always grossly underestimated, I think, the benefits of commercial fishing, of recreational fishing, and the value that it creates to these economies. I mean, as someone who fishes in the Gulf and a lot of these areas, going down to whether it be Venice, Louisiana, or some of these other areas, fishing out of there. I mean, these are economies based, oftentimes on this industry in and of itself. So, I think what we have to do is do a lot more to, manage the recreational side as we have the commercial side. There has to be more, policy driven towards that. I think you have to encourage, again, access and availability of these species. I don't do as much red snapper fishing as some of my buddies, but the 9-day season that I get it from my friends that are spear fishermen and fish off some of the the drilling platforms and stuff like that about it. And I mean, they're saying like it's a joke. They have to plan their whole year around this 9-day season. So I think for me, this is getting in the weeds. But again, I think you have to do a better job managing that. I think you have to have them more involved on the recreational side, not just on the commercial side. I think we have to do a better job of managing, not only the species themselves that are the game fish, but also the forage species. So you have with the menhaden and sort of the striped bass issue that you had in the Northeast, which is a little bit more my home water. That has seen a pretty great comeback. Over the last few years from when I was a kid and trying to fish, and it was sort of, it'd be great if you caught one a week, and now you're able to go out and have great days. So I think there's probably a lot you can do there, as it relates to managing the forage side of things, managing the game species, and really treating it on a similar level to what you do with the commercial side. But I think the biggest thing is you have to recognize that the value and the revenue generated from the recreational side is immense, and so many of these economies greatly depend on it that I think if people realized that and saw how important that was to those areas, I think they'd give it a little bit more time and a little bit more credence and actually start looking at these issues more greatly on the recreational side.
Doug Olander, who's the editor of Sport Fisherman magazine, a Bonnier title, one of our titles, wrote recently about how commercial fishermen are setting up trips, or one anyway, is setting up trips where he takes recreational fishermen on board his commercial boat. They catch some red snappers under his quota, not the recreational quota, and then they go back to the dock and they buy the fish that they caught from the commercial guy. It's gotten to that point. It's changing sport fishing as we know it. The problem is that you really need to. It would be a massive change because of the way that that fish are managed and how the sport fishing impact is really not consistent with the way that commercial fishing is impacted. This would take an awful lot of work and a lot of change. So would your candidate be willing to do that?
Yeah, listen. Again, for to every other point that I've been talking about, it's an important thing. If I had more kids fishing, more kids hunting, more kids in the outdoors than playing video games, I think you're doing them a service for life. I think you're creating a different individual. If I look at the lessons and stuff I learned in those pursuits and those pastimes, to say nothing of the economic aspect and drivers of that. So I think you have to preserve that, and no different than anything else. I think if you make these things too prohibitive, you make it too difficult, you make it too complex, you make it too expensive for people to get out and do these things, they're going to pick another hobby. And when they pick another hobby, all of that revenue's gone, all of that conservation benefit's gone, and it doesn't matter what they do then, because there won't be the conservation to preserve these species and to make sure that there's a enduring population there.
Questions on red snapper or commercial fishing in general, or recreational fishing? Okay. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, Don, you once said that when it comes to being a hunter or fisherman, you could tell if a presidential candidate was being a phony if he missed.
Yeah.
I'm curious if that would also apply to trout setting in saltwater. But the bigger question is, how important is authenticity? You mentioned some of these people, judges and whatnot, that just aren't even familiar with. And whether you're talking about red snapper or any other management decision, how important is it to try to put people in these positions of power who are authentic or have a better idea of how these resources should be managed?
Well, listen, I think it's incredibly important, certainly on this issue, and it's a great. I appreciate the question. It's a good one because you see that so often today, and it's not just about the environmental side of hunting and fishing. I mean, it's government in general. I mean, the sort of cronyism that goes on, where it's like, well, you're a big supporter, so I'm going to make you, the premier advisor on XYZ topic that you have no idea about, or you're going to go negotiate a deal, against China's best and brightest, even though you've never negotiated a car lease in your life. It's that sort of cronyism in government that's making us. That's why we run so inefficiently. If we could get rid of the waste, the fraud, abuse, and the stupidity in government, because you have people doing things they're not qualified to do, they've never done in their lives. They've never, when I talk about these politicians and see them talking about job creation, meanwhile the only jobs they've ever created are lobbyists. They've never signed the front of a paycheck. it's laughable to me. So putting people that actually have real experience in there means something. I mean, again, because I'm an outdoorsman, because I'm a hunter, because I'm a fisherman, I've end up doing these things. And so I guess that quote, I think I said that in Iowa early on. I was doing a hunt over there, and I guess it was with Terry Branstad's son, and I was there at the governor's deer hunt, 2 weeks prior, and they're like, well, are you doing this because it's politics? It's like, no, I slept on my friend's couch, for a week prior to the governor's hunt to make sure I got a couple of days in the woods, because this is actually something that means something to me. When they ask, they're like, well, how do you know if someone's just doing this for the photo op? I go, well, how many birds did I shoot? They're like, I think, whatever it was. I think I shot 9 birds. They're like, well, how many shots did I take? They're like, well, you took 9 shots. I was like, that's the difference. You see the other guys, and I hear the stories about the guys that go out with their politician friends, and they shoot a box of shells at never pluck a feather, and they talk about their great love of the outdoors and being sportsmen, and meanwhile they're sitting there in the photo op with their finger on their trigger of a loaded gun with the safety off, and it's just so fake. So again, I'll be candid that in terms of some of the detail, even when we're talking about, I recognize I'm no expert, but I could find the guy who is to put them in there. I mean, these are complex issues and they are substantial, but you do have too many people that are just there and they're photo op people. They're saying, okay, I'm going to cater to these guys and I'll take that picture and I'm going to move on, never to care about the issue again. For me, hunting and fishing is my lifestyle. It's what I do. I have not spent a weekend in New York City in 10 years. Because we get out of the city, and even though I work there, we get out of the city every weekend, and we go up to my cabin in the Catskills, or we go somewhere, and we're outdoors, we're in the woods, we're fishing, we're shooting, we're hunting, whatever it may be, and it's something that I want to, make sure my kids have. I don't want them to be that city kid that, wouldn't know how to change their oil or their tire if they got a flat because, all they know how to do is, walk around the streets. Now, I think the cities are great. There's cultural aspects of it that are very nice. But you have to see both sides of that. So for me, it's an important part of my life. And throughout this process, I joke I've been in politics for 4 or 5 weeks now, but I think I've figured it out pretty good. I've seen so many people that are just so disingenuous about these things. But these are the people who ultimately get put into positions to make these decisions that we're going to be stuck with, and our kids and grandkids behind them are going to be stuck with for generations to come. And they're making these decisions with no basis, with no passion, with no knowledge, with no experience. And it's just there because they were put there by their buddies who, they wrote a big check to their campaign for. And it's disgusting to me as an American. Got a little off topic.
No, that's quite all right.
I think it's certainly relevant. But
any other questions on this? Jody?
On marine sport fishing, the past 5 to 10 years, there's been an increase in marine protected areas. I just came back from California, and I know that they are now potentially reneging on reevaluating recreational fishing on marine protected areas. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you plan to do about marine protected areas and recreational fishing?
Well, listen, again, I think that's probably in the weeds for me in terms of the details on California coastal things. I know there are a lot of issues that are plaguing those fisheries. I think as some of them come back, I mean, I know people up north further talking about sort of the massive influx of of seals and some of the other water mammals that have made incredible comebacks, but now they're destroying the salmon stocks. And so again, each one of these ecosystems is almost an individual ecosystem within itself. But I think certainly recreational fishing within those areas makes a lot of sense. I think you can do a lot in terms of with limits. I mean, I know a lot of guys that want to go out and they want to fish, and they're not there about just filling a bag limit. I mean, for me, I catch and release 99% of what I'm fishing for, and that may not necessarily be the norm, and there's nothing wrong with keeping fish either. But I think there's a fine balance, and I think as people get more and more familiar with conservation and those efforts, I think you see a much greater influx of people practicing those practices that are going to ensure that, hey, you can fish and you can still do that without doing any damage to those stocks, and again generate an awareness to those areas that then will help protect them in the future. So I think I wouldn't have an issue necessarily getting in there and allowing people to fish, but again, everything would have to be done within reason based on the individual science at the time.
All right, thank you. We'll move on to gun rights. No discussion about hunting and fishing would be complete without a discussion of gun rights, and this has been an issue this year. Of course, guns are an integral part of the sporting experience for so many of us. and the presidential campaigns have been seemingly transformed into referendums on gun rights and even the meaning of the Second Amendment. Your candidate's opponent was vague during a recent interview on whether keeping and bearing arms actually is a constitutional right.
No, she wasn't vague.
No.
She was very clear. She said that the Supreme Court got Heller wrong. And all that Heller says is that you have the right to keep a firearm in your home. It has nothing to do with personal carry. It has nothing to do with concealed carry. It has nothing to do with hunting or shooting. She said that the Supreme Court got Heller wrong. And that is just the simple right to be able to keep a firearm in your home. And as a sportsman, to me, that's very scary.
Okay. So I think I know the answer to this question.
Yes, can I be more clear?
Does your candidate believe that owning a firearm is indeed a constitutional right? And would your candidate fight against or reinstate the so-called assault weapons ban that would outlaw many versions of the AR-15 type rifle? And these are versions that many sportsmen use today to hunt.
Of course. Listen, the AR-15 platform's an interesting one. I live in the People's Republic of New York. I'm also a competitive high-power shooter. I'm a master rank high-power shooter. I travel all over the world. A lot of high-power guys use AR-15s as a platform. My gun, if something were to go wrong with it and I somehow cracked my receiver, I wouldn't be able to get that gun again that I've traveled all over the country with. That was made by the armorers from the U.S. Army Marksmanship Unit. To do this, I wouldn't be able to bring that into my own state. Frankly, I have to modify it as is to be able to have it in that state. I mean, it's a modular platform. It's the notion of some of the left's policies on gun rights. The only people that they affect are people who are actually willing to abide by the laws put into place. People like myself who aren't going to go to jail for this. When I looked at the quote unquote SAFE Act and when that was instituted, and I know people involved very much in New York City government. I know people who are very instrumental, in those campaigns. And I mean, they told me, I won't bring up their names to put them in the spot, but they told me basically the SAFE Act was done so that Governor Cuomo could be the first person to have acted, on firearms after Newtown. It was action for the sake of action. No, it didn't make sense. Law enforcement officers were committing felonies by carrying their service weapons the next day because there was no exemptions, because you had people, again, to our conversation 2 seconds ago, you had people writing legislation that wouldn't know a muzzle from a trigger. It doesn't make sense. And so when you have these legislations that are put into place that are only going to affect people who are actually willing to play by the law, that doesn't make sense. The Second Amendment, this isn't some sort of, afterthought 500 years after the Constitution. This is the second thought after freedom of religion and speech that our founding fathers thought. And so to me, the fact that there's even a notion that shall not be infringed is not clear is ludicrous. And you've seen this constant attack, and I've seen it in my states, and I can't order ammunition online. And when they say, well, this man was arrested and he had 1,000 rounds of ammunition in his vehicle, and he was, excuse me, I have 1,000 rounds of ammunition in my vehicle almost at all times because it's called 2 bricks at 22. I'll blow that through that with my kids on a weekend. It's ludicrous. But what they've done is they've very effectively vilified people who are good, law-abiding citizens, sport shooters, and tried to pigeonhole them into these things. The AR-15 is a platform. It's a base. I can make an AR-15 look like most hunting rifles. I can also make it look like the mean and vicious assault rifle that you see all the pictures of. It's nonsense. It's a metal receiver. You can do these things with anything, and they've done a very effective job of vilifying it. But in the end, the people who are going to be affected by these laws are going to be the people who are actually going to follow them. And by definition, that's not a criminal. A criminal is the person that's going to do it anyway. A criminal is going to be the person that's going to get it. If you look at San Bernardino, with California's most restrictive gun laws, in the country, if you look at Paris and France's gun laws, they got fully automatic weapons into there. Terrorists who want to do these things, they're going to do it. And guess what? It doesn't just take an assault weapon. I wish it was as simple as that, but 3,500 people were killed in 9/11 using a plane and a box cutter. What we have to do is we have to actually admit that radical Islamic terrorism is a real issue. We don't blame it on guns. We don't blame it on law-abiding citizens. You don't blame it on the NRA. And then, then when you get into the media, I see all the rift that they're trying to cause, even between us, who've been very vocal about this, being pro-Second Amendment, and the NRA, when they try to say, well, there's a rift because, no one thinks that people on the terrorist watch list should, of course people on the terrorist watch list shouldn't get firearms. But what they don't talk about is they don't talk about the million people that are on the terrorist watch list that have no business being on the terrorist watch list. What they don't talk about is the people on the terrorist watch list who are on the terrorist watch list because their name sounds similar to someone else somewhere else. What they don't talk about is that there's no due process for these people to actually then get off of this list, to actually then be able to buy firearms. That's what we're saying. Everyone agrees that no one should be able to, certainly no terrorist should be able to get firearms of any sorts, let alone assault weapons. But what we have to say is there has to be due process. Now, that's not the convenient 140 character or less soundbite that everyone gets their news in these days. But that's the education that people need to understand on the issue, and that's where people have to go on the issue. So there is no rift there. We have to use some common sense, but you also can't have then, again, a backdoor methodology by which the government can say, well, congratulations, now 300 million people are on the terrorist watch list, and we'll tell you when and if you can ever get off of it. That doesn't make sense. So what we need some common sense. What we need is due process, and those things have to be instilled back into the Second Amendment issue.
Quite clear, thank you. Questions on Second Amendment, on guns? Okay. Last topic, just a little one, climate change. And the question is very short. Does your candidate consider climate change as a threat to fish and wildlife? And if so, what would a Trump administration do to combat it?
Listen, I think it is a complex issue because if you look at the science of it, you obviously have a lot of the science pointing one way, but then you have a lot of people coming out and saying the other. I think when we talk about climate change, you certainly see weather patterns that are shifting, whether that's caused by industry, whether that's caused by whatever over time. I think has probably yet to be shown to me and to the client. What I do think we have to do is make sure that we're preserving habitat, that we're preserving fauna, flora, in a way that makes sense for the environment, that doesn't put us at such odds with the rest of the world that we're competing against. What we do still have to do is we still have to have an economy. What we can't have is legislation, and this goes whether to our trade practices where we have free trade, but we don't really have free trade because we have so many government rules, regulations, bureaucracies, and things that have to be implemented that don't make it truly free because we're going through so many obstacles and so many hurdles to be able to be competitive with the rest of the world. And now we do share an ecosystem with the rest of the world. So if we're not doing something, we're putting ourselves through these hurdles. Meanwhile, everyone else is, just having free will of it. Guess what? We're still going to be affected by that. So what I think we have to do is have, common sense environmental regulation that hopefully we get everyone else in the world to also follow. Because again, as much as I'd love to be able to say, hey, we can create our own little vacuum above the United States and do that, that's just not the reality of the situation. The disasters caused in China and other parts of the world where there is virtually no regulation, where there is we're going to be affected by that virtually as bad as they will be, and certainly over time, because that's how the dissemination of molecules work. So what I think we have to do is become more conscious as a people, meaning as humans, not just as Americans in general, take care of some of these things, have reasonable standards that don't put us as Americans at odds with the rest of the world, where we can no longer be competitive and we're hamstringing our businesses, which force our businesses to go overseas, where there are none of these regulations, where then manufacturing is happening in areas where you are creating massive pollution and you are creating a disastrous situation for the environment. So I think what we have to do is really work together as a world and as a species to mitigate this across the board, not just penalize Americans, under this notion that, hey, well, we're going to do it and you're going to be hurt, and guess what? That's going to solve the problem, because it's not.
So under a Trump administration, there would be no steps to undertake carbon reduction unless it was an agreement, more of an international.
I think there could be steps, certainly, as it relates to carbon mitigation, but I think what we would want to do is make sure that we get the rest of the world to also play ball. I don't think, especially when you talk about how much of the manufacturing and stuff that does contribute to these issues is done elsewhere. We're becoming a much, much smaller part of that problem. So I do think that we have to work with the rest of the world to make sure that they're also implementing those measures. That's not to say that we couldn't implement common sense measures that make sense in this country. What we can't do is go so far as to do it that you penalize our industry so badly that they're forced to either go abroad, create jobs abroad, create economies abroad that are ultimately going to cause the same problems everywhere else. So I do think we have to work with everyone to do it. Again, I think we can make common sense legislation that works for Americans, that can be that could hold American corporations accountable for certain things. But again, I think we can't overstep to go so far so as to make it impossible for American manufacturing to exist, which is a lot of what has happened over time.
Thank you. Questions about this?
Sure.
Yeah, it says outdoorsman. I really appreciate how vocal you've been in support of public lands and the Second Amendment. But as a journalist attending the Western Media Summit, I'm also a big fan of the First Amendment.
Yes.
And so I'm just wondering, why revoke press privileges for the Washington Post? I mean, is that something that...
Listen, I think it's very simple. I mean, when they write headlines that are then retracted 2 hours later because they're shown to be blatant lies, because they're pushing a leftist agenda that's just very anti. I think it makes sense. This isn't about if you came in and we'll take criticism, we'll take tough criticism. I mean, no one's taken tougher criticism than we have, over the last year. I think that's a matrix that I don't think anyone compete with. But when you're publishing blatant lies and doing it under the guise of journalistic integrity, that doesn't work either. That's not fair. And I think and this goes for both sides. I mean, I think both the left and the right, in journalism these days, they've been very polarized, and people have picked sides on those things. You're no longer getting a fair and balanced news coverage. And when you look at social media and you look at the things that people follow, the algorithms that all of these companies use, I mean, people read what they want to read, they see what they want to see. They don't get to see the other side of that story anymore, and I think that's a shame. But I do think that if you're running as a conservative and you're on the conservative side of things, I think 95% of the media is out to get you from the start, and I don't think that's really something that too many people, even on the left, would contest. And I say this now because I've met many of them and I've become friendly with a lot of them. And that's sort of the inside joke that I'd have. I'd never say their names because they get killed by their publications. But I mean, it's the inside joke of well, I know I'm on the other side, but I'll let you give you. It's like, wait a minute, how can you be from one of the largest publications in the world and be on the other side? That's not what I understand journalism and free speech to be. So there's nothing wrong with tough criticism at all. We've taken plenty of it. That's fine, and I think that's fair. If only the other side were given that same amount of criticism instead of sort of the free passes. And if we talk about the issues that the other side gets passes on that we're brought up in very salacious ways. I think it's fine. So they have access. They see what's going on. They're there. But I think it makes a statement of that. You shouldn't have a media that's used as someone's pit bull. In that case, the Washington Post was bought by Jeff Bezos, who's a billionaire liberal who's used that as his attack dog to try to go after anyone conservative to protect his corporate interests in many other ways. And it's a shame that that's happened. But people aren't aware of that, and they see what used to be a much more credible venue of journalism going out there doing that, and they're saying, oh, well, that must be fact. Meanwhile, it's not, and that's not fair. And I think what we have to do is make sure that people are covering these things honestly and effectively. So is that a fair enough answer to the question?
Sure, I just think that the people reading should be able to make those decisions.
But the people shouldn't be, again, told something that's a blatant lie. In the case of the Washington Post, they said that my father blamed, directly said that Barack Obama was because, the Orlando stuff happened because of Barack Obama. And it's just not, it's not at all what he said. It's not at all what he said. Obviously he talked about, Barack Obama's, inability to talk about Islamic extremism, but that wasn't what they said. I mean, they basically said that he said it's there, and that's a lie. So I don't think it's fair for a publication of that supposed level of credibility to go out and publish something that's a blatant lie that influences millions and millions of people, because that's not right either.
Question about question about the Bureau of Land Management's approach to balancing energy development and recreation on public lands. The Bureau has pursued a fairly aggressive campaign to reform how it leases lands for oil and gas. It's crafting master leasing plans to keep drilling further from national parks and high value habitat and recreation areas. How would a Trump administration pursue that balance, and would it roll back any of the reforms that the Bureau of Land Management has put forth?
You know, of the ones that I'm aware of, I mean, I think, you know, certainly protecting the high value areas, protecting the national parks, I mean, I think all of that makes a lot of sense. So, you know, I'm not aware of anything that's, you know, very flagrant in there that we'd want to roll back. I do believe, you know, very strongly that we do have to have energy independence. I think that's probably one of our biggest national security issues. I think that's probably very different from the other side of things, but that's also easy to say when they're receiving, you know, $25 million from the government of Saudi Arabia. So, you know, I want to make sure that people's motivations are at least clear when it comes to that. So for us, you know, energy independence is, you know, a paramount national security issue. I think it's a paramount economic issue. We do have to preserve those lands, and I think what I've seen thus far has been very reasonable. I think we've worked, you know, pretty well to ensure that we have the ability to, you know, drill and frack, you know, where it makes sense, and to take advantage of the, you know, the great natural resource that we have, you know, in our gas reserves. The fact that it's taken, you know, this long to be able to utilize some of those things, you know, perhaps is, you know, a factor of technology. And I think as the technology continues to get better, it'll be easier to do those things, you know, safely, effectively, efficiently, to better preserve, you know, all of those lands. And I do think it's important to preserve the lands, but, you know, I think. So again, I think it makes a lot of sense to do that, and, you know, but we are, you know, very pro U.S. energy because, you know, again, I guess maybe we didn't get $25 million from the Saudi government, and, you know, a lot of the other Gulf states, multiple other millions of dollars to our quote-unquote foundations, but, you know, it is an important issue for us. It's something that we can't take lightly, and we do have to have, you know, energy independence.
Just one quick follow-up. The federal district court just north of us 2 days ago tossed the BLM's hydraulic fracturing rule. Said BLM did not have the congressional authority to regulate that form of energy production. What are your thoughts on that? Should the BLM regulate hydraulic fracturing?
I think they should be involved. You know, again, I don't know that they have enough expertise on some of the issues. You know, it's probably, you know, again, you know, out of my scope on the radar. I'd have to speak to someone who's, you know, more in tune on the issue, because again, I think for me that's getting into the weeds. But, you know, I think they'd have to be involved, certainly as it pertains to the lands that, you know, they're overseeing. You know, but I would imagine there'd need to be other people involved that can talk, you know, more in detail on the science of it.
Kerry Dennison, Trout Unlimited. I'd be remiss if we didn't ask a question about drought. We're talking about climate change, and as someone who lives in, works, and loves the West, the arid West, which we're in now. I would like to hear how the Trump administration would address the pull on our water resources, the effects of not enough water to go around for the multiple needs that we have here in the Colorado River Basin and the Western United States in general, and how that affects habitat, our trout habitat, our fisheries habitat, and the economies that rely on that.
Well, listen, it's pretty important, and you know, I love it out here too. I actually am the first graduate of the Wharton School of Finance to move to Colorado to be a bartender for a year and a half after college, so that I could fly fish and hunt all over, you know, all over the West. So, you know, again, it is something that's important to me, and it's not just important to me because I like to trout fish in you know, the New York and the Catskills, where I get to do more of my fishing these days. But you know, having lived out here, you know, I've seen that as an issue, and you know, again, it comes down to balance. I do think, you know, as you know, talk about, and I was having a conversation about water earlier, you know, and some of these issues. I mean, I think there are technologies that are getting put into place. I think there's sort of mandates that are being put into place to be able to use the water that we have, which is a very finite and limited resource, you know, more effectively. We do have to preserve those trout habitats, but we can't do that at, you know, at the expense of all of agriculture. You can't do that at the expense of major localities. But we were talking earlier about Las Vegas and how they're basically using the same amount of water today as they were 25 years ago because of a lot of these practices. So I think what we'd have to do is look at expanding that and making sure that that actually still exists. I know for me on the East Coast side of things, a lot of our water issues stem from deals that were made 200 years ago about control of water, and the watersheds that I fish end up feeding New York City and a lot of those areas, and they'll put flows in jeopardy, and those towns and those areas depend entirely, oftentimes, on the trout fishery and what's going on there. But it's being managed by people in New York City, so that people leave fire hydrants on in New York City, free flowing, and so people can play, and that doesn't make sense either. So. Again, I think you have to work, on a state-by-state and case-by-case issue, because some states are going to be more ag-dependent, some states are going to be more populace-dependent, and try to use best practices to, not only change individuals' mindset and how they relate to that, but to preserve all sides of things. Because, again, I want to make sure we keep as many blue water fisheries as we possibly can, but we can't do that at expense of everything else. Also, so there's going to be, implementation of best practices and looking at that. To make sure that we can have the best of all worlds.
Anyone
I have
else?
a question, actually. So you talked a lot about common sense legislation and creating collaborative initiatives. It actually seems like with so much disconnect between folks in power who don't know about the issues, or folks in cities who don't get outside, there's a huge opportunity to educate. And I wondered if a Trump administration would engage sportsmen and the media, actually, in an effort to educate folks.
I think without question. I mean, I think, perhaps I'm the best example of that. I mean, I've been very vocal out there about being a hunter and being an outdoorsman and being a fisherman and being a shooter. And, as a business person, hey, that's something that's going to be controversial with some people, and others it won't be. And so you make friends, you make enemies. It is what it is. But ultimately, I think people have to stand up and they have to speak about these things, and they have to let the truth be heard. So, that could be something that again, I've dealt with and I've had a lot of criticism for. But again, it means enough to me that I'm actually willing to actually get up there and stand up and talk about these issues and talk about the facts. Not just talk about, oh, it's so terrible, but hunting is the original form of conservation, and to let people understand that, to get more people into it. I speak oftentimes about being a mentor and having mentors, and all the people that were mentors to me along the way that allowed me to, how unlikely am I to be, if you just looked at statistically, a big proponent and an advocate, of the outdoors and of the shooting sports. I mean, kid from a successful family in New York City. I mean, it wouldn't happen all that often. Now, there's plenty of hunters in New York City. Most of them don't have the guts to talk about it. It's, that's a shame. But I think if we have the open dialogue, if we have, the conversation, if people are willing to take those risks and actually talk about it, and talk about how great it can be for their lives, what it can do, for the environment, what it can do for fauna and flora, I think that's an important step we have to take to stop people from vilifying, outdoorsmen. Especially hunters, but even fishermen these days. I mean, can't tell you the number of people. It's like you catch a trout. Oh my God! I can't believe you did that. Did you think about it? Some of the mindset has gone just a little bit off into crazy land, as far as I'm concerned these days. So, you need people to be out there. You need people to be vocal, and you also need people ultimately to step up and be mentors. I think one of the biggest things I've seen for hunting. And I've done this for so many of my friends that are New York City guys that, you took them on a street in a small town in a place like this, and that'd be like, the wilds of Africa for them. But, you take them out, shoot sporting clays, take them up on a walk-up, pheasant hunt, something like that. And not one of those people, and even people that weren't really into the notion initially, not one of those people hasn't been like, that was one of the greatest days I've ever had. When are we doing it again? So I think what people need to do is oftentimes, rather than say, well, I want another day on the water to myself. Take someone, and I know it's a pain in the butt, sometimes to teach someone how to fly fish or to teach someone how to shoot or to do this, and you may want to do it yourself. But be a mentor. Take a couple people out. Get that next generation in there, whether it be youth, whether it be women. I think some of the industries have done a really good job. I think archery's done a phenomenal job bringing women into the game and showing them that this is this thing, and But the shooting sports should be doing the same thing, and hunting and fishing should be doing the same thing. And if we can get more youth in there, if we can get more women into the game. And I always say, I got my wife into it because if Mama Bear's into it, Baby Bear's going to be into it. And it made it easier for me to get my kids and to do that. And if I can get more people to do that and to put forth that little bit of extra effort to show people, to take them out there. I can't tell you how many people I've done the same thing with guns. Oh, guns are a terrible thing. And you take them out, shoot some steel, shoot some clays. Wow, that was awesome. I can't believe, there's just such misinformation out there. But because the people who are perpetuating that misinformation are usually the people that have none of the information, have never done it, and never experienced it, it's perpetuating the problem. I think if people actually spent the time and actually tried to learn about it and actually do it, they'd realize it's not sort of this evil, terrible thing that it's been made out to be.
We are almost out of time, and I have one final question for you. Why should sportsmen vote for Donald Trump?
Because for us, it's a real issue. The preservation of our habitat, the preservation of these species, the ability to access these lands, and again, being from a successful family, 95% of my hunting is still done, either not through big outfitters, not I don't do the fenced hunt thing. That's not my it's about access. Again, I'm the first graduate of the Wharton School of Finance to move from New York City to Colorado for a year and a half to be able to hunt, to fish our great wild lands. Those issues are something that's important to us. The access is something that's important to us. The Second Amendment, which again, I'm also a bow hunter, but I do a lot of hunting with a gun. Those issues all come down to it, and they're big sportsmen's issues. And I think to have someone like myself and my father's here talking about the issue, and again, not just doing the photo op. And I'll talk if I guess that's the good segue to talk about the other candidate who talks about her great experiences growing up duck hunting with a rifle. Well, no, I mean that's a verbatim quote. You all have probably heard her say that. Now, I'm a pretty good shot, but I'm not shooting ducks with a rifle. So maybe she's a lot better than me. But it's the phoniness, to the pandering to a voter bloc, pretending to be something you're not to try to get their vote. That's not what this is about. For me, hunting and fishing is my lifestyle. It's how I choose to live my life. It's how my brother and I choose to live. It's how we're going to raise our families. And again, we're going to be the ear in my, the voice in my father's ear on all of these issues, preserving that. And again, not just for the guys, that are, able to hunt private land, but for the guys who want to hunt public land. For the guys that, for me, I vacation. I take my vacations going off into the wilderness, doing 2-week backpack hunts, 500 miles away from the nearest road. I mean, that's how I have my fun. The ability to do that is paramount to us, to keep those traditions. And I think, the more people that could see that, I think the better. And I think, for me, as it relates to those issues, if you're a sportsman, it's a no-brainer because we're actually living that lifestyle. We're not just telling you what you want to hear.
Very good. All right. I know you have a plan to catch. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mike. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Before we wrap up, it's a very good segue. First, Mike, thank you very much for doing